All right, we are ready to learn how to use our machine and make some stitches. I've prepared this little square of fabric, just scrap fabric. You should do the same, just use any scrap because you want to make sure you know how to stitch before you get started. All right, so let's do the very basic stitch that you will always use. I want to make sure that my stitch length, which is this dial over here, is set to 2.5. I want to make sure that my stitch width, which is up here on the top, is set to 0. If your machine doesn't look like this, every machine does have a stitch width and a stitch length. Just find it, look for the either zigzag line or the straight line. And I want to make sure that my stitch is set to the straight stitch, which is this dial on my machine, it's over here. All right, so it looks like we're good to go. So before I sew, I place my fabric into my machine. I place my needle down with the hand wheel on the side. I lower my presser foot, and then for any basic stitch, you always want to back stitch before you begin. So you sew, press it on the presser foot, and then find your back stitch button. It'll have this U with an arrow on it. You hold that down, you back stitch, that locks your thread in place, and then you keep sewing the length of your fabric or however you want to go. Most important, you want to watch these guides here on the side. These are your seam allowance guides. I'm sewing with 1/2 inch right now, and I just always want to make sure that the fabric's edge is 1/2 inch away from my needle. I get to the end of my fabric, and I want to back stitch again to hold it in place, and then I can lift my presser foot up with the back. There's a lever for your presser foot on the back of your machine, and then I take my needle out, and I cut it, and that is just a basic straight stitch. Go ahead and practice making straight lines. The more you practice, the better you'll be. All right, I just played around with my straight stitches, and look what I noticed. My thread tension was out of whack. This was too loose, it looked too tight, so I messed with it until I had my straight stitches again. So I'm so happy because now I'm ready to sew and it'll look nice and clean. So now that we've mastered the straight stitch, let's talk about the other stitches. The straight stitch is used for any basic sewing with any woven fabric. I'm going to give you a rundown of all the different types of fabric later, but a woven, just keep in mind, is anything that doesn't stretch. When you're working with a fabric that does stretch, you'll want to use a zigzag stitch. Here's how. We want to adjust our dials here to the zigzag dial. I can keep my stitch length the same, but I want to move my stitch width. So I'm going to move that to 2.5 also to match my stitch length. Let's see what happens. I'm lowering my presser foot. I'm just going to sew straight line. And here we have a zigzag stitch. You can adjust your zigzag to look different based on the stitch width and stitch length. So feel free to play around with that and see what happens. Also, I know you're really stoked about maybe the fancy stitches that your machine has also come with. You can see them here. Just move your dial and then adjust your stitch width and stitch length accordingly. If you're not sure which one to use, once again, I always recommend to practice. I'm going to do this one, and I'm going to make my length smaller and my width stay the same. Let's see what happens. And we got this funky little shape. It looks like if I made my stitch length closer together, the image would be tighter. Let's try it. So now you'll observe with a shorter stitch length, the same exact pattern is now closer together. So feel free to play around with all of these. You don't typically need them for basic sewing. You'll only need the zigzag stitch and the straight stitch, but they can be fun for decorative purposes while top stitching. If you're shopping around for a sewing machine and you're not sure which one to get, any sewing machine will probably work pretty well. Some quality brands are Singer and Brother. You can also find a vintage sewing machine. Those are fun and really pretty. The most important things for sewing, as I said, are the zigzag stitch and straight stitch, which every sewing machine will have, including the vintage ones. We have mastered the straight stitch. Now it's time to master the curve and the corner. So let's do the corner first. I'm gonna put my fabric into my machine as I've been doing. I lower my presser foot down, I lower my needle down. I'm gonna make sure I'm on straight stitch. Perfect. Then let's sew. I'm following the seam allowance. And once I get to my corner, I'm gonna stop before it because I wanna keep the seam allowance. I'm gonna make sure my needle is in my machine, which I do with my wheel. Then I lift my presser foot up. I rotate 90 degrees. I lower it back down. My needle had to be in the machine so that it would hold its place. And then I continue sewing. Beautiful. Ta-da! A perfect 90-degree angle. Let's do that again. Whee! I'm gonna make sure that my needle's in my machine. I turn it, put it back down. My needle's in my machine. I turn it, put it back down. Needles in machine. So just practice going around corners. I'm not doing anything in particular shape-wise right now. I think I'm gonna try to make this square. Whee! Now it almost feels like I'm on an Etch-a-Sketch. That's funny. But just practice your corners and your pivots. Whee! Now I'm going to show you how to do a turn. Notice how this fabric is not straight. I'm indeed turning. All I'm doing, okay, so my seam allowance right now is 1/2, so it's along here on the 1/2 inch mark. And I just need to make sure that as I sew, that this line where my needle goes in matches the 1/2 inch mark around. So I'm always following right here next to my needle. And it's staying nice and straight around the corner. Slow and steady wins the race. Oh, see, I got too close now. That's a mistake. And I just always want to make sure it's 1/2 inch. Slow and steady. So as you can see, I rounded my corner, and that is how you sew a curved edge. Now that we've sewn our curves and corners, let's go over how to cut them. For the corners, you just want to make sure that you cut in a nice straight line right up next to the corner, but never past, or else you would be cutting the real inside of your garment. So I'm gonna cut that. I'm gonna cut the other side right up next to that corner there. And when it comes to your curves, you have your outside and your inside. For the outer curve, you want to cut out little triangles, little notches to allow the fabric to open up, let it breathe. When you're cutting, I thought these snips would work better. So I'm cutting out triangles. Come on, little guys. There we go. Do one more. And then on the inside curve, we want to just do a nice straight line. You don't necessarily need to do the triangle. So get some of those pretty close to our sewing edge. And now that we've done that, it's called clipping your curve. Now that we've done that, it will open up nicely. See how this line can now become a nice straight line, and this one is opening up as well. Let's learn a few more things. Let's talk about your fabric. There are two main categories of fabrics that you need to know about: wovens and knits. Within these two categories are many subcategories. I'll run over the basics.